Everybody, thanks so much for joining today for Agents of Influence here with the Global Game Jam. I'm Jess Rowley, and I'm the Events and Program Manager. We have a fantastic hour for you today as I'm being joined by Anahita Dalmia. Anahita is a co-founder and a CEO of the company Alteria, which creates interactive stories around mediums as theater, games, VR, etc., allowing participants to enter a different world in which they have agency and impact with an unfolding story with the goal to show them that their actions matter and empowering them to build the world that they want to see. Her projects have won the Aspen Institute of Information Disorder Competition, SBIR grants from the U.S. Department of Education, and has been a finalist for the 2020 South by Southwest Innovation Awards. She's a three-time published author on achieving social impact using experiential design and is also an associate faculty member at the Media Education Lab and on the board of advisors for the Game Academy and UC Riverside's Design Thinking program. This webinar is part of a series leading up to the United with Ukraine 2025 Jam, Ctrl+Alt+Disinfo. Ctrl+Alt+Disinfo is a multi-stage international jam to create high-quality, engaging video games, focus on teaching media literacy and critical thinking to increase skepticism around propaganda and disinformation. This 27-country initiative is part of the two-year United with Ukraine Games project, which seeks to train 2,500 game developers, launch 30 impactful games, tackling the topic of disinformation from around the world, and reach a public audience of over 70,000. During the lead up to Ctrl+Alt+Disinfo kicking off this month, we'll be rolling out these educational resources and webinars led by experts to help jammers build foundational knowledge around disinformation, serious games, and more. Registration is now open. If you're not already registered, you can find more information at the United with Ukraine Games website, and I'll drop the link in just a moment. We do also have Q&A turned on, so if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please do drop them and we will answer them at the end. Before we start, I do want to just take a quick poll just to get the experience of those who are here in the audience live. I'm going to be asking a simple question. It is just, how would you rate your knowledge of disinformation prior to this webinar? So if you can just take a moment and fill that out, that would be perfect. And without further ado, I'd love to introduce Anahita. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to bring this presentation to us.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm Anahita, and as Jess mentioned, today I'm going to be sharing with you Agents of Influence, which is a spy-themed media literacy video game to make informed decisions. I just kind of want to sit for a second on the idea of making informed decisions, because that's really the crux of why we started this game. Like, we started this game because we realized that mis and disinformation, which is, false information, either unintentionally false in the case of misinformation or intentionally false in the case of disinformation, was misleading people into taking decisions that actually don't serve their purpose. So the crux of this game is, how do we give people the skills they need to make better decisions by finding better information? Just to give you some context and background, the name Agents of Influence actually originates from Cold War spy history. An agent of influence was used to refer to a spy that spread disinformation in foreign countries. But our goal with this game is to reclaim the term agents of influence, because agency, your ability to navigate the world around you, without outside influence, and influence, your ability to make a difference in the lives of the people you care about in your community, are actually really positive attributes. Um, this was a project that we started during 2020, which, as some of you might remember, were very trying times. COVID hit us, and we had no idea what to do. The world that we knew seemed to be crumbling around us, and a new world was kind of rising from the ashes in front of our very eyes. Um, it was at a time like this that every decision we made seemed to matter more than ever. Whether we choose to wear a mask or not, how we spoke about issues such as diversity and inclusion, who we voted for, would all have ripple effects and repercussions that would affect humanity for decades to come. And it was at this point that we started to realize that misinformation and information overload was deceiving people or overwhelming people, misleading people, so that they couldn't take decisions that would be best for them and the people they loved, which is why we decided to create Agents of Influence. So let's have a closer look at that.
Welcome to Agents of Influence Cyber Danger, an educational, spy themed media literacy video game created to empower the next generation of students to fight misinformation on the internet. Virginia Hall High is under attack. A nefarious organization named Harbinger is manipulating the student body with lies and deception. Luckily, you and your team, the Agents of Influence, are there to stop them. Students will learn to question the trustworthiness of information, investigate the trustworthiness of information, and apply this knowledge to make better informed decisions.
So that's a little bit of what the game looks like. It's been a long journey since we started. When we started in 2020, me and my team were fresh college grads with no background in video games. We did more live, game design like escape rooms or immersive theater. No background in mis and disinformation or media literacy. So it was a steep learning curve for us, but we've accomplished a lot in the past 4 years. We have won several awards, including the Aspen Institute's Information Disorder Competition, funded by Craig Newmark of Craigslist. We've had several research studies with Stanford Social Media Lab. We've had over 700 schools sign up to test with us, with probably about 40 to 50 schools testing with us pretty regularly as we've gone through this. And we've had a lot of good and bad moments trying to figure out how do we really make a game that makes a difference. And the good news is it feels like we're on the right track. So let's talk a little bit about our process and what it took to get here. As I mentioned, when we started off, we knew nothing about media literacy, misinformation, and to some degree, educational video game design. So we spent a lot of time learning. I'd say we spent the first 6 to 8 months literally doing research, and research took a lot of different forms. Research included emailing experts. I think I sent out about 300 cold emails over those 6 months asking them, hey, can we have some time of yours? Media literacy experts like Renee Hobbs, game design, educational game design experts like Jesse Shell. We spoke with everybody so that we had a better understanding of what audience we should be building this for and what are the things that we need to do to succeed in this endeavor that we had undertaken. Beyond that, we also did a ton of just reading. So we read academic papers on the psychology of mis and disinformation, what kind of games have been successful over there. Get Bad News and Harmony Square has a lot of research associated with it. We read curriculum. We read curriculum such as the News Literacy Project, MediaWise, Crap Test, things along those lines. And we made long lists of things that we think we would need to teach to successfully and holistically teach the process of making informed decisions and critically evaluating information. We also recognized pretty quickly that we wanted to focus on a school audience because that's the way we would make the maximum impact. If one classroom adopts your game, you have 30 to 200, 300 students that would be playing, and school environments are very specific environments to be designing towards. We learned about things like curriculum and standard alignment and data privacy security laws for school environments and all of these different things. How much time does a teacher have to teach? How long should the game be? And we sent out surveys that asked teachers, how much time do you have in the class? What subject do you teach? What topics do you want to teach? Like, how will this game be useful for you? And a lot of that research has been the guiding light of the work that we've done. Here are some key takeaways that we had. One, school use case. I've already touched upon why schools were the best place. People were required to be teaching media literacy. There was not a ton of engaging content out there for it, and it was the best way for us to make a large impact. We also thought if we maximized for a school use case, there was still a world where we could reach a more general audience if we just changed the marketing. But if we had a more general game, it would be hard to fit into a school context easily. We also learned there was a ton of content and skills that seemed relevant to media literacy and teaching about mis and disinformation and how to combat it. Like literally, we had documents that were 7 to 8 pages long. Things like, analysis, identifying biases, how do you check sources, how do you cross verify sources, how do you know what trends are there, how do you have conversations, identifying evidence, observing proof. There was so much. And every single one of those things can be a game within itself. Like there's so much content, it is impossible to cover everything. And we needed to figure out what battles we wanted to pick and what content we could teach that would have the most impact. We also wanted to design the game flexibly. So, one teacher would tell us they wanted a 20-minute game, another would tell us they wanted a 10-hour game. The discrepancy was huge. And the best advice we got was design something that's flexible. If someone wants to teach about logical fallacies, teach about logical fallacies. If they want to teach about politics and misinformation, let them teach that. If they want to use it for 30 minutes, let them do that. If they want to use it for 6 hours, let them do that. Um, I was very frustrated when I initially got that input because I'm like, you're not asking me to design one game, you're asking me to design 100 games. But trying to build something that could be used in a variety of contexts by using different pieces of it that have similar design philosophies and teach similar skills was a really useful takeaway from our research process. So based on all the research that we did, we picked four main learning objectives, and we go to each one in various depths depending on how much content you go through with us. Um, the first is research. The way we define research is opening up a bunch of different resources, whether those are links, compute, books, anything else, and corroborating information, finding trends, finding discrepancies, and asking questions on what kind of information should I be looking out for to know what to trust, whether that's the source, whether that's the evidence, whether that's the bias. Um, we want people to compare several things and start reaching their own conclusions based on it and understand perspective. Analysis allows us to get into more detail and all of the skills I mentioned above while focusing just on the skill of critical analysis. And that we go through things like logical fallacies, biases, credibility, purpose, questions that everyone should be asking themselves on any piece of media they get, but they typically don't. And then finally, we decided we also wanted to include conversation because most media literacy or critical thinking curriculum doesn't fully recognize the impact of social emotional learning and relationships on how our perspectives on information is shaped. Um, if your best friend tells you to believe something, you're more than likely to believe them, no matter what evidence they're showing you for it, because you trust them. When someone you love has a very different opinion that might be based in fear based thinking, that's a very different context than being like, here is my proof. Trust the source. And we want people to have the skills to be able to navigate the space recognizing the emotional ladens that is included in it. And ultimately, we want all of this to culminate in making meaningful decisions that benefit you and your community. Um, this is what culminated in Agents of Influence as it looks like right now. So I want to talk a little bit more about like what our vision for the game is. Our goal is that each student who plays the game um, becomes a responsible information consumer who starts to recognize the impact the information they consume has on their worldview and decision making, and has the skills they need to make better decisions so they can create a better world. We want this game to be used in classrooms across the world, and we want it to be a doorway to further education, engagement, and involvement. This is how we've currently structured the game. The game is modular. That means we have different episodes, as we like to call it, focusing on different topics. And each one of these can have several games in conversation, research, and analysis, all under the same topic umbrella. This allows us to bring some level of skill leveling while also allowing teachers to focus on different topics and skills as is interesting to them and as time allows them in their classroom. We also have several modes of play. Story mode is where people actually get to make meaningful decisions that have an impact in the long term of the game. So if a decision you make in episode 1 can play out in episode 5. In arcade mode, it's just skill building. So we have each one of our games, conversation, research, and analysis, at 5 different levels of difficulty. And that's probably been one of our most powerful and popular use cases so far. And then we lead all of our players into supplemental material. Currently, it's just an Excel sheet, but we are currently working on making it a smoother experience where you get recommendations right after you play the game. This includes things like discussion questions for classrooms so you can connect what you saw in the game to your real life. It includes pre-learning on like, here's how to have a good conversation. And it includes further resources that people can use in their everyday life. Things like websites such as all sites that will show you different perspectives on the same problems, cybersecurity software, other media literacy games. But we want people to really have the opportunity to dig their teeth into this larger landscape after they go through this experience and hopefully after they care about this problem. Um, so let's talk story for a minute. In our story, it's super simple. You are a spy at Virginia Hall High. Your grandfather used to be a Cold War era spy. One of his nemesis has reappeared, and it's your job to deal with the problems that he's causing in the school. So let's take a little bit more of a detailed look on that.
Life moves fast at Virginia Hall High School. When I first arrived, I was just a normal freshman. Now, I'm a spy. A few weeks ago, a shadowy figure known only as Harbinger started causing trouble at school. Harbinger used a device called the lullaby to transform some of the students into a kind of mind-controlled being that can influence the thoughts of others. We call them sleepwalkers. These altered students are dangerous assets in Harbinger's plots to spread misinformation. Luckily, I've joined with a group of student secret agents to stop them. We call ourselves the Agents of Influence.
So that's the basic story. Let's talk a little bit more about each game, their goals, and the mechanics that we use over there. So our first game is the conversation game. As many of you probably recognize, people have forgotten how to have respectful conversations with people that they disagree with. In the conversation game, you need to pick dialogue choices that take the conversation forward. Good dialogue choices will get you further, such as empathetic listening, active listening, labeling their emotions, identifying assumptions, whereas bad conversation strategies, such as being defensive, being critical, blaming the other person, is going to, surprise, surprise, get them to stop talking to you. The next game is the analysis game. In this game, people are faced with one piece of media. We currently are only using text, but want to use videos and images and social media posts in the future as well. And in this, students get to critically read or examine a piece of media, answer true or false questions on them, and use tiles that they win by answering these questions correctly to play a strategy game on the left that keeps the energy, pressure, tension high for them to actually care about what they're reading and answering on those questions. Then we have research. Research is really focused around the idea of evaluating sources and comparing information to make better decisions. So we're throwing people into weird situations like you are now in a Shark Tank and you need to research a couple options just the way you Google it, to be like, hey, what is this that I'm trying to accomplish? What information over here is relevant and reliable? You get to ask some questions about the content that you are looking at, and then you need to make decisions on what information to trust. And based on that, you have little mini scenes play out, really showing us that research is critical in informed decision making. Um, let's take a couple moments to examine the details of that, though. Um, as I mentioned earlier, something that's been really important in our process is taking learning objectives and turning it into mechanics. So, something that I want to just walk you all through is what that process looks like in much more granular detail, because that is a process that will likely be very helpful to many of you as you are designing your own media literacy or misinformation oriented games. I took the conversation game as an example to talk a little bit more about our methodology when we were building this game. The first thing we did was set learning objectives. And the basic point we started with is how do we have more effective, better conversations? So that is what this entire game is oriented towards. And all of our mechanics and all of our work is moving towards the goal of how do we teach people to have better conversations. Like always, you go and do some research after you set out the goal. So we reviewed a lot of curriculum on how to have good conversations. Something that stands out to me is, the four horsemen and their antidotes. Reading that very effectively outlined bad conversation strategies and how you should be combating it. We read a lot of books around influence and conversation strategies and negotiation, including how to win friends and influence people and never split the difference. We learned all sorts of weird conversation techniques, whether it's to do with approach, whether it's how you connect with people and listen empathetically and actively, labeling people's emotions, identifying assumptions, all sorts of stuff. And we tried whittling it down to what makes the most sense for us. We also looked at different things that we found interesting as we were going through this content. One concept that really stood out to us was the concept of trust. You know, a lot of conversation is around the long term idea of relationship building. If you have more trust with somebody, you can have a conversation that goes terribly. And they still might not just walk away, say it's, your best friend, even though there's a chance that you can hurt them more and break more of their trust if you do that. If you have a completely new person, then you have the opportunity to earn their trust. That makes a lot of things a lot easier. Another thing that stood out to us was personality typing and observation, where you need to pick up social cues on the person you're talking to understand things like their values, how they see themselves, what's important to them. And you need to use that and leverage it to some degree in the conversations that you're having to become effective at this particular technique. And much like games, there's a give and take in that. There's a goal, there's a sense of tension on I can lose this if I'm not correctly thinking about who this person is, what they care about, and how I can work with them for them to achieve that while also meeting my own needs. We also looked at different experiences, including games for inspiration. So, obviously, real life conversations and negotiation techniques was an inspiration. But another one that stood out to us and in many ways has been foundational to our game is Pokemon. I think it did a really effective job of like typing things. So, if you're a fire type, you are weak to water moves. And that felt analogous to conversations where if you're a sensitive person, you're more open and receptive to empathy. Whereas if you are someone who is hard headed and proud, you might consider that more condescending, depending on how it's delivered. So certain people are more receptive to certain types of conversations and certain conversation techniques. And we thought there was a way we could pair that, where depending on the personality type or the values of the person you're talking to, you need to pick conversation strategies that are conducive to getting you further along with them. So those are some of the ideas that we were playing with. Um, this culminated in version one of the conversation game. In version one, we picked four options: question, assume, explain, connect. And we had little text that you can see if you click on one of them, and you need to have a conversation with someone who has different states. What worked over here was that this really helped people see different conversation techniques, like, oh, the same thing can be phrased as a question, as an assumption, and as an explanation. I never really thought about how to frame exactly what I'm saying so that the person would be receptive to me. We really honestly just didn't get the exact points mechanic down for this, because we had a range that you would take or gain points in for every single one of them. And for example, in Connect, like every time you connected, you got plus points. And then people would just connect, 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 and stop reading. And it took away some of the tension that we wanted to frame in the game, and people weren't paying attention to the content that they were putting forward. Then we pivoted very hard in the other direction. We now have none of those labels. We only have dialogue choices. This works better in some ways, but it's lacking some of the learning objectives of the previous one. And we weren't able to very effectively integrate that personality type of matching in either of these iterations, even though both were successful in different ways. We are now going back to iterate on the game. And something we want to bring back is the idea of trust that we found interesting initially. So maybe you have conversations with the same people over time and you have a trust meter that affects how much opportunity you have to mess up and how much you don't. And we are playing with ideas of, let's bring back some of the labels. Maybe it doesn't need to be these four every time. Maybe we have different labels. And maybe we have personality types that are more open to certain types of labels, and try to put that kind of pairing and analysis and observation and conclusion drawing that we initially found interesting back in the game. So that's just an example of how we took like a basic learning objective, turned that into mechanics, and have iterated on it over time. And something to just keep in mind as a game designer is, you're never going to think your game is perfect. Like, that's just the reality of it. You're always going to want to do better. And I'd really encourage people to very clearly set out like what is good enough. And once you reach that bar, you can continue to do better, but it's okay if you can't as well. I also want to take a couple moments to contextualize why this work is important. So, one of my main takeaways while doing this is just that good people make bad decisions on bad information. And I'm really hoping that each person can gain the skills that they need to make better decisions by finding better information as a result of playing this game. Um, why are misinformation games important? You're all game designers. You're here to design misinformation games. And I wanted to highlight the two things that I think are particularly unique and important in games that no other medium effectively um, captures. I think one is skill building. You get to practice skills over and over in situations that seem applicable in a way that very few other mediums allow you to do. And the second is contextualizing. People will be able to connect what they're playing in this game to their real life, because we have the opportunity to simulate situations like what they will see in their real life. And I think those are really outside of obviously just engagement, I'd say that's also really important. But those are things that very few other mediums effectively accomplish. Um, I have some resources for all of you. So just some games that I really liked and have been big inspiration for us is one Cat Park. They are working with with the Game Jam, Global Game Jam on this entire project, but fantastic game. And Phoenix Wright. Ace Attorney Phoenix Wright is another really good game that focuses on the same skills of critical thinking and building a case that's done really, really effectively. Some suggested resources, things that I found especially useful. I think if you want to just get a view on misinformation, disinformation, its impact, different techniques, and different remedies around it, the Aspen Institute's Information Disorder not competition, disorder report is fantastic. And in terms of the resources and supplementary material and curriculum I got the most out of, I really like the crap test. I think there's several opportunities to make a game just out of that. And the news literacy project is great for getting a really holistic view on misinformation, even though I don't think you all might have the time to go too deep down that rabbit hole. I have a QR code and a link here. You're welcome to open up the link, take a picture. But this includes a database with a ton of resources we've collected over 4 years that we have found useful. So hopefully these are also useful to you. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. And you can also have my contact information. Um,
Awesome. Thank you so much. That game looks incredible. um, how long did it take you guys to make the game from start to finish?
So we are not completely finished yet. We just got
Sure.
our grant. The goal to be completely done or say we are done with it is Jan of 2026. Um,
Awesome.
Probably spent about 2 years in production. So it's been a 4 year timeline, but a very frustrating process of we spent 6 months researching. Then spent 3 to 4 months doing a prototype MVP that's saleable. Then we did a Kickstarter to see if there was like legs and commercial viability here. All right, Kickstarter successful. We're not building anything else until we have further money. We spent another 6 months fundraising.
Mhm.
Won the Aspen Institute's Information Disorder competition. Great. Spent another 6 months producing and then spent another 6 months fundraising. Then, got the SBIR phase 1, spent 6 months in production there. Then, 3 months to write a new grant, 3 months to receive the next grant, again,
Mhm.
months gone. And now we have about 2 years runway to finish,
Awesome.
which is really exciting.
That is really exciting. Um, I think it's really important, especially with the jam, to this is, I mean, this game is incredibly in depth with a lot of mechanics. So for these jam games, of course, they are not going to be as, I mean, we want I don't know how to say the best way is they're not going to be a perfect game, but it's definitely something that is a jumping off point that you can really create something really wonderful, and something that you can keep working on for a long time because it's not like disinformation is really going to be going away anytime soon.
I also feel like scope according to the time you have. Like we
Yeah.
went this not with a hard timeline, like you need to figure out what your constraints are. We went into this saying we want to make a really cool product that solves
Hmm.
this. And we said we'll base our timelines and our fundraising attempts around that. If you are working with the reverse problem, I have 3 days, I have 4 days, then you need to be working backwards on I have 3 days, 4 days, what's the best I can do?
Yeah.
And I literally think like conversation analysis and research are really, really, really broad topics. I don't know if I'd encourage people to go that broad, but literally, if you wanted to take like the four horsemen of the conversation game,
Hmm.
that into a game, I think that is something that's much more achievable and within scope for
Yeah.
a 3 day thing. Like, let's just do logical fallacies. What can that look like? A game just on logical fallacies. So I think that there's a lot of ways to whittle all the things we did down and say,
Yeah.
doing a lot of broad stuff, but not a lot of specific stuff. What specific stuff can we do and do it well?
That actually answers the first question that we got. But if you have any more thoughts on it, that would be great. The question was, are there any disinformation topics that you think haven't been tackled but should be?
I think we've done a really good job of being really broad, but as a result of it, we do disservice to everything that's specific.
Hmm.
When you look into like a topic like analysis, credibility, logical fallacies, finding evidence, observation, like source checking, all of these things. You do some of that in every single game. If you wanted to do a game just on source checking, I can see that being really, really successful. So I think our game's a really interesting place to start because you'll see we've touched on a lot of things and decided we are going deep by touching on a lot of things for a couple of
Hmm.
broad categories, but there's so many opportunities to take any one of those skills and try to really puff it up and take that in different directions.
Definitely. And I think having something that's a bit more specific does uh, help with scope as well. I mean,
Absolutely.
it kind of goes hand in hand. Really, they help each other out. Another question is a lot of these games seem to be more about reading than playing a game. Of course, a lot of these are narrative based games. So, how do you combine the information and still make it a fun game for people to play?
We are still figuring that out, to be honest. Here are things that we have found worked for us.
Hmm.
Um, One, having stakes that people care about, even if they have to do a lot of reading. So if you're trying to answer a question or make a decision that you care about, you're more likely to read through the article to make that decision. If there's a virus that's going to eat you up if you don't answer this question correctly, you're more likely to read the information. So we haven't found a way to make reading fun. We think that reading is necessary for a game
Yeah.
like this. But we have found ways um, to make people do it anyway and not mind doing it as much. I think there's a lot of great examples where that are a little less text heavy. Like ours is a very media literacy responsive, think about the content you're consuming kind of game. Like in Cat Park and Harmony Square and stuff like that, you're creating and spreading mis and disinformation. Like that's a much more fun mechanic. And
Hmm.
is it's just like a design decision we made to make it much more contextualized and much more narratively based and much more, critically evaluate the information you're observing, as a ground rule. I think those can also have amazing benefits. They're just different design decisions and the different benefits.
Yeah, and it also is the audience that you're looking to target too, can have a huge play in it. I mean, the games that you make for kids are much different than what you would make for adults, anyways, but there's also a
Absolutely.
lot of crossover. There's plenty of, especially when you think about the resurgence of um, games that were popular in the 90s, having that have an influence on the games that are played because there's that nostalgia effect to it. That's something that I could see being very easy to play into. I think I saw on Steam, like Backyard Baseball, for example, is back and it came out in 1997. It's back on Steam in 2025. So it's one of those things where you can easily play with something that is from a nostalgic point of view that will help people be like, oh, I remember this as a kid. Um, at
Absolutely.
least, at least in my generation, I think.
Absolutely. And I think what it's doing, like not just looking at games, but also looking at media as a whole,
Hmm.
a lot of anime that came out really way back when is now being like touched up and re-released. Like
Hmm.
Ranma, thing I watched when I was like 6 years old. Uh, and they now have redo of it and it's super popular on Netflix. And my little brother's like, did you ever watch Ranma Half? And I'm like, yeah, I did. You're just 10 years younger than me. What are you doing watching it? So I think it's super interesting that a lot of this content as a whole is kind of coming back around. And I think like at least a key part of our design philosophy has always been rich narratives that survive the, test of time. Like one of our design philosophies was teach evergreen skills. And that's why we want, for example, in the analysis game to be able to have things like social media posts and video
Hmm.
and things along those lines that people are evaluating and analyzing, because the skills are the same. You need to ask the same questions. What is
Hmm.
the purpose? What are they putting in here? What are they leaving out? What's the evidence? Whether that's text or whether that's, videos. And I think it's so much more effective to teach people what questions to ask and help them find the answers than try to very much limit to a medium that you're working within. And that's also why we made a completely fictional game. We
Hmm.
want something that even 5 years, 10 years down the line resonated and
Yeah, of
made
course. Yeah.
people.
I kind of touched on this question too organically. Do you think there's a difference between making the disinformation games for kids or adults?
Absolutely. I think that is both a question of age range and audience and a
Hmm.
question. So, for example, because we wanted to be in schools, that's one of the reasons we're so text heavy. Like analysis and research are things that teachers need to cover anyway. And we have teachers who are saying, like, all right, I'm skipping my class on sources and I'm giving them this game instead. And they can do that because the game is designed that way. Most adults are not in that kind of context. So
Hmm.
you make something that is engagement first, or someone who's really interested in learning about misinformation, but then why would they pick your game over like a webinar on misinformation? So you really need to figure out what niche you're building for
Hmm.
and optimize for that specific niche. And like the other thought on that is just like the stories, the mechanics, and like the art that resonates across different ages is just different. You know,
Hmm.
design decision we made is that you are a high school student in this game. That's because we are optimized for middle school. And middle school students tend to think high schoolers are cool. So now about playing as a high school character, and you need to make a lot of narrative choices if you're a narrative game. If you're not, if you're like Angry Birds for misinformation, where it's like plow plow plow, that's false, that's true, you are in a completely different kind of range. But particularly as a narrative game, you need to make a lot of choices on what story will resonate with your audience, and that's very different for
Hmm.
different.
Definitely. This is a bit more of a specific question, but also incredibly helpful. What program specifically did you all use to create the game?
Unity and WebGL.
Okay, easy enough. I just there's so many platforms out there that people are able to use. It's whatever everybody is most comfortable with and has experience is highly recommended. Uh, Another question. So this is you said you did not know disinformation before making these games. So what advice do you have to learn about it if you are making a game but you don't know a ton about misinformation and
It
disinformation?
would take an hour range, whether that's 2 hours, 10 hours, 300 hours, and like try to set out like what is it that you need to learn and for what purpose, and try to find information around that. If like you go to my previous, QR code and link over here, there's a ton of resources on like academic reading around misinformation, other misinformation games, whatever it is. You don't need to be an expert to make a misinformation game. You just need to know what your design parameters
Hmm.
are. And for this particular project, your research is probably as necessary or as quick as your decision making needs to be. If you literally look at agents of influence, decide I'm going to spend 30 minutes playing that, say, I really like this logical fallacy stuff. They're not teaching it enough. I'm going to make a game on logical fallacy. You can call that a day. Like you don't know more about mis or disinformation. It's if you really want to dig into like what are the different factors here? What are my options on things to be teaching? How have like 50,000 other people done it? Because like there's a lot of misinformation games out there.
Hmm.
Like which ones do I resonate with? What audience were they made for? Like if you want to go down that rabbit hole, you can, but you
Definitely.
have to make a
Yeah.
good. Mhm.
Yeah, because it's like it's kind of towing the line between being an expert on a topic, but it's also something that you see is there's a gap in knowledge about where you're like, I really wish that I had a game that talked about this specific topic. So then you do all the research, you become the expert, and you're able to provide those resources for people in a different context.
Exactly. And there's super simple stuff like logical fallacies does not take a ton of time to master that
Hmm.
or game out of it, you know? Like if you want to look at every one of like the 3,000 logical fallacies that exist, maybe. But for a good game on logical fallacies, you really should be picking 4 to 10 and really hammering those in. And maybe you want to look at like the top 50 most important ones to decide what your 4 to 10 need to be. So you can decide which ones will be most relevant over there. But the process is as extensive as you need it to be to make quick, good decisions. Or, forget quick, just good decisions.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The next question is a great question. Are narrative games better ways to teach disinformation than other types of games? Because as we've seen, a lot of these are narrative type games, but there are so many different genres out there. Um,
I
yeah,
think
what are your thoughts on
narrative games are just contextually easier. Like narrative games don't need to be what we have, which is like choose your own adventure, somewhat linear or, in the same world storyline. Like, Cat Park is also a somewhat narrative game. And the fact that you are building on some level of story and you have a role and all of those things. I think the reason that media literacy games tend to be narrative games is just that media literacy is inherently narrative. Like when you are evaluating media, you're always looking at the story and the context and impact. And that is just the natural context of it.
that?
And I
Hmm.
think the result of it, most
Yeah.
media games tend to be in that genre, but I think there's opportunity to be experimenting and finding more things that work.
I mean, I really liked your Angry Bird reference. I think that's a game that resonates with a lot of people across a lot of different age ranges. So if you find something that is really I immediately have, I feel like, a ton of ideas about how to implement that in a way where it's somewhat narrative because you can't avoid the narrative aspect of it, but it's um, it's a bit more like game mechanic driven than just a game where you're reading a bunch of information and trying to kind of cipher through all of that.
Angry Bird Logical Fallacies Edition. You need to pick logical fallacies, and depending on whether or not you choose the right one, it powers how far your bird is gonna go.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's see. So I do have a question specifically about Global Game Jam, actually. So it's kind of a multi-parter, so I will go through them. So what's the difference between a simple Global Game Jam and one with a prize pool? I can answer that one. So the Global Game Jam is, if you're not familiar, it's a 48-hour jam that takes place this year. It's between January 20th and 26th, and it's 48 hours within that time period. That game jam itself has its own topic, has its own diversifiers, and it's not a competition. It's not meant to be one where you're building a game with the intent of having it be a winner per se. So the game jam itself is more about collaboration, meeting new people, especially if you're going to be going to a site that's in person. It's a great way to get involved in your community, and it doesn't have a prize pool, so that is something that is completely separate. Where this Unite with Ukraine and the Ctrl+Alt+Disinfo does have a prize pool at the end of the game initiative. The implementation processes it's asked, are the implementation processes different and why are they in the same period? We are kicking this off in the Global Game Jam. So the first part of the Ctrl+Alt+Disinfo is within that 48-hour period within the initial game jam. And then there's going to be a 2-week period and then a multi-month period afterwards. There is a on the United with Ukraine Games website. The link that I had provided earlier has a full timeline in which you're able to see when each part of the jam is going to be kicking off. Just bring that up so I can make sure. So yes, so it is the 2 weeks, and then it is the 2 week period between January and February where you're iterating your idea, building out your prototype during that second round, and then during the 2 month period, which is between February and March, there's going to be mentors and feedback to help revise and refine your game to submit for judging at the end of the third round. And the final question of that is, can a topic from a 2 week jam be added to a jam with a prize pool? I'm not entirely sure I understand the topic from the 2 week jam. So the 2 week jam, you're building into the game that you are submitting for the final 2 month period at the end of this game jam, the United with Ukraine. Different from Global Game Jam. Global Game Jam's the kickoff. It's where you get together with your group, you find that idea that really resonates with everyone, you start to build that game, and then you go through the process until you have submitted that game at the end with the chance to win possible prize. We have another specific game design question. How can color influence choices and how to best use it in a game? This person specifically wants to make a 3D game in Unity.
Um, that's something for you to figure out. I think the basic philosophy over there is people are drawn to particularly bright colors or colors
Mm-hmm.
to the rest of your picture. We look over here, I very specifically have my name and website and bright pink, whereas the rest of the colors are more muted. So that is much more of a visual design question on if you have colors that contrast one another, you're automatically drawing people's eyes to something, and then they can, that's more likely for them to pick or pay attention to that as a choice. Um, I think there's like how you turn that into a 3D game, I don't have a lot of advice on. I can see an
Mm-hmm.
game on like literally color manipulation and mis and disinformation. Like, I forget what the term is. Um, not I forget what the term is, but there's a term for how UI UX manipulates people into making decisions that they don't want to see them make. And I think that's just a really interesting concept on people are just making decisions on things that their eyes are drawn to and see how it's not actually helping them. I think that's a premise for a really interesting game in some ways as well.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, we're coming down to our last few minutes. If anyone has any additional questions that they'd like to drop, please let us know. I will be submitting this to our YouTube channel afterwards. If anyone has any moments that they're looking to review, I will be putting this on the resources page on the United with Ukraine Games website under resources, as well as the YouTube channel specifically for United with Ukraine. It's also a place where you can watch the previous webinars as well that we held. We've held about 3 so far, and this is our fourth. And I actually want to take a moment to submit the final poll. Give me 1 second. Let me just launch this. So this question, if you were here at the beginning, we asked what was your knowledge of disinformation prior to this webinar. So this question is, how would you rate your knowledge post-webinar? So if you are able to take a moment and just fill that out, that would be really fantastic. Awesome. All right. Okay. Oh, and there is one additional question. How do I submit my game when it's done? We will have more information about that on the website. The initial phase will be submitted through the Global Game Jam website. There's also a registration page that we'll be able to send more information about where that will be uploaded and where to submit that during the different phases of the games. Awesome. Great. Well, Nahida, thank you so much for taking the time today to This is a wonderful presentation. I mean, it's clear you've had a lot of experience with this, and you've been able to really consolidate all of the things that you've learned to create this game into a really fantastic presentation.
So glad. I hope it was helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Love to have you back. All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to end this webinar now. If anyone has any additional questions about United with Ukraine and Ctrl+Alt+Disinfo, you can also email us at this web address, jam.org. Perfect. And yeah, I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day. All right. Take care.